Okay, should we get started? All right, so I'm just going to briefly welcome you. I want to start by thanking you all for coming. It's a pleasure to welcome you here at the 17th World Congress for Social Economics. And we're also very happy to be doing this at UMass Boston. It's been a while since the last World Congress, which was at Colorado State University in 2018, so we had a long break for COVID. And we're very excited to bring this group together with a lot of new faces back together. The Association for Social Economics has been a space for pluralism in economics for a long time now. Its history dates back to 1941, and the association also has two historical journals, the Review of Social Economy, which started in the 1940s, and the Forums for Social Economics, which dates back to 1971, I believe. And we are very happy to have editors of both journals here with us this week and tonight. I also want to note that we are also very happy to have past presidents of the organization in this room. Just to name a few who are here and participating, we have John Davis and Zoraya Mami. We have Ellen Mutari, who's not here tonight, but was a teacher in our summer school earlier this week. We have George DiMartino, who we are very lucky to have moderating our panel tonight. Julie Nelson, I don't believe is here, but might be, who's also a professor emerita at UMass Boston. And Stephanie Seguino, who is also not here tonight, but was supposed to be speaking in our panel, and so I would like to mention that as well. In fact, the room tonight is full of people who've been committed to social economics for a long time, and we're very happy that you are all here together. I also want to say that we are just finishing a 2-day summer school, which brought together 32 junior scholars from many parts of the world, and 10 excellent teachers as well. So our theme this week is social economics in a time of interlocking crises. Tonight's panel is on race and stratification with William A. Darity Jr. and Dania Francis. And before I turn the panel over to George DiMartino, I would like to acknowledge, first of all, the role of ASE in bringing us all together. And I would also like to acknowledge the financial support of the UMass Boston Economics Department, the UMass Boston College of Liberal Arts, and the UMass Boston Provost's Office in supporting our event tonight. I would also like to acknowledge then the contribution of the Review of Social Economy, which is also a co-sponsor of this evening's plenary panel. All right, so before I turn the floor over to George, I am very happy to introduce the College of Liberal Arts Dean, Pratima Prasad. Dean Prasad is going to start us off with a few words.
Hello, everybody. My name is Pratima Prasad. I'm the interim dean of the College of Liberal Arts. Thank you, Professor Harry Constantinidis and Leila Davis, for inviting me. I am honored. The College of Liberal Arts is very happy and proud to support the World Conference for Social Economics. First of all, I want to congratulate Professors Constantinidis and Davis for all the work that you've put in to bring this conference together. It's not an easy task to bring together more than 100 scholars from all parts of the world and the United States, organizing panels, event management, etc. So kudos to you, and you did this alongside your teaching and administrative responsibilities. Harry, I know of your administrative responsibilities well, so I'd also like to welcome all of you to our beautiful campus here at UMass Boston, and a special welcome to the plenary participants, Professors Darity and DiMartino, and our very own Dania Francis. I've had whom I've had the pleasure of working with closely on a variety of topics. The topic of the conference and the many, I was looking through the program and the many panels which advances economics for the social good, as well as the topic of today's plenary, which is race and stratification, fits right in with the mission and values of the College of Liberal Arts and the mission of the university more broadly. And there is no better place than UMass Boston, so therefore for this this conference to take place. And there's no better place, there are no better people than the faculty of the economics department to do this. Because, I'm the dean of a college that houses 21 departments, and just like a parent is not supposed to have favorite children, I'm not supposed to have favorite departments either. And I don't, believe me. But I have to say that I have been sort of watching closely the amazing work that the faculty of the department do. And as teachers, they do a fantastic job with our students in the classroom who, whether you know it or not, it's the third ours is the third most diverse student body in the country, and most of our students are first-generation students. And they take the work that they do in their classroom out into their scholarship and into their professional world and the discipline of economics, and this conference is the fruition of all of that. So I am really proud and grateful to be the dean of a college that houses a department like this. So I'm sure that today's plenary, as well as tomorrow, you have a full day tomorrow, will result in a lot of rich discussion. And so I wish you an enjoyable day tomorrow, an enjoyable plenary. And with that, I turn the mic over to our provost, Professor Joe Berger.
Thank you, Dean Prasad. Good afternoon. All right, let's try that again. Good afternoon. So let me echo Dean Prasad's thanks and gratitude to the economics department, to the College of Liberal Arts, certainly to Layla and Harry for all of your incredible work in pulling this together, along with your colleagues, and the staff, right, that it always takes a team, right, to take care of all the logistics and make sure this happens, and this includes our great IT team who's here helping us today, so I'm very grateful. I'm also grateful that for all of you who have traveled to be here with us and to join us on a beautiful day. And it's great timing because we just launched our beautiful new quad out here this year, so you're one of the first external groups that's getting to see our campus in its new glory. But in being asked to support this Congress and again, to have the privilege to come and be able to address you and participate with you here this evening, it was really easy for me to say yes, because I think this is very important. And I do think that, the Association of Social Economics, given its mission and purpose, aligns very, very well with who we are here at UMass Boston. And in particularly, now I had to do a little bit of research given all the different associations and for which I have some responsibility for. But the fact that the Association for Social Economics really focuses on the reciprocal, and I think this is a really important concept, the reciprocal relationship, right, between economics and broader questions of human dignity, ethical values, and social philosophy. This matters, right? And that as we think about, right, the social dimensions of economics, but really, what are our ethical responsibilities? We don't just produce knowledge, right, for the sake of producing knowledge, right? How do we ensure that we use our expertise, our talents, right, to inform policy and practice in the world? How do we work with other forms of expertise that comes from practitioners to make sure that we're addressing the most fundamental and critical questions of our times? And so I thought it might be helpful in sort of thinking about this to look at our vision statement that we as a university came together less than 2 years ago to re-examine as we were engaging in a deep and broad strategic planning process across the campus. And so I want to read just part of that vision statement because I think it really does speak to why you're all here joining us in a collaborative spirit. And so as part of our vision statement, as a university, we embrace our responsibilities as a public research university bringing diverse people and ideas together to seek knowledge and improve lives, here in Boston, across the nation, and around the world. We are dedicated to promoting the practice of democratic citizenship, preparing a diverse, talented workforce, informing equitable public policy, and strengthening the social and economic resilience of our city, and I would say surrounding communities and society, as the foundation for multiple levels of impact. And I think this certainly fits the spirit of the Association for Social Economics, but also why all of us are here together. So I also want to say that the focus, in particular of the Congress this year on race and stratification in a time of overlapping crises, also fits very well with what we aspire to do as a university. And it helps make it both appropriate, but also a privilege for us to host this year's Congress. Because it is true that we are in a time of great peril, right? We continue to suffer the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was the worst global health crisis in a century, and that it exacerbated and laid bare the long-standing vagaries of racialized oppression and inequality, the growing inequity of the hoarding of wealth, record numbers of displaced persons around the world, the specter of war and violence, and the accelerating ravages of human-made climate change. Certainly, we are dealing with overlapping crises. But these challenges make our role here at UMass Boston as a public research university more critical and important than ever before, and it makes the role of the Congress, right, incredibly important. So I applaud you on embracing this theme. And it also aligns very well with another part of our strategic plan, where we identified what we call 4 grand scholarly challenges, real-world challenges that require multidisciplinary perspectives to inform them. And these include addressing climate equity, bridging divides in health equity, education for the future, reinventing education that fosters inclusive excellence, and then the 4th one, advancing a just society. So again, the dialogue that you are engaged in here together will inform, right, our efforts to make what small contributions we can to advance a just society. And so I want to finish by saying that also in our strategic plan, we identified some cross-cutting commitments, and I want to just emphasize 2 of them that, again, I think relate very well with the topic here this evening. One is that we are committed to becoming a leading anti-racist and health-promoting institution. That's more important than ever before. There's a larger political discourse that makes it more important for us to explicitly articulate that. But we also recognize that this is aspirational. So many of us are here at UMass Boston because of the mission. So many of you're doing the work you do because of your mission and your values, but none of us have any laurels to rest on. There's too much work to do, and that includes right here as well as elsewhere. And finally, a commitment to be engaging in community collaboration. None of these significant crises that we're addressing can be done alone. We must collaborate, we must work together. And so that's why, with these points of intersection, I really truly am honored to be here with you this evening, and that we really can make a difference together so that the knowledge that we generate can lead to relevant, practical, and meaningful action-oriented agendas that will help all of us make a positive difference, locally and globally. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to say I have known for a long time that UMass Boston has a first-rate economics program with really wonderful scholars, theoretically informed, doing socially, who are socially engaged. But now it's so great to see that that's how it fits so well into the vision for the university as a whole. Thank you so much, and to the Dean for your welcome. It's my tremendous pleasure to chair this plenary session featuring two extraordinary scholars, Drs. Dania Francis and Dr. William Sandy Darity. I'll introduce them properly before each of them takes the podium. The topic before us of this plenary is race and stratification in a time of interlocking crises. As our speakers themselves have demonstrated with tremendous insight, the linkages between racial privilege and persecution on the one hand and social, political, economic, and ecological crises on the other are deep and enduring. Many here will know that in 1962, Milton Friedman published a book that proved to be extraordinarily influential, Capitalism and Freedom. In that book, Friedman does many things, but one of the things he does is he takes time to distinguish between two kinds of harm, what he calls positive and negative harm. Positive harm arises through coercion, and in Friedman's case, the kind of coercion that really bothered him or that attracted his attention was physical coercion, the gun to the head. Friedman argued for that kind of harm, the government has an obligation and a moral right to intervene to stop the harm. But on the other hand, Friedman defined negative harm as that which arises from the normal operation of social systems like the competitive market system. Friedman argued famously that the state has no warrant whatsoever to intervene to address this kind of harm, the harm that happens below the surface as a result of the normal operation of society's institutions. He argued that negative harm of that sort might or might not be regrettable, but it was not morally indictable, and it did not provide warrant for the state to intervene. Now, that reasoning by Friedman provided generations of economists with the means to dismiss out of hand the insights that we now associate with concepts like structural violence, which was introduced in the 1960s by the peace theorist Johann Galtung. It provided economists with the means to dismiss out of hand the insights now associated with critical criminology, such as the tradition known as semiology and social harm. And it provided economists with the means to dismiss out of hand the insights now associated with stratification economics. That was launched by one of our speakers and elaborated and applied with tremendous power by both of our presenters. Social economics is and ought to be a natural home for the serious, deep engagement with racial injustice and with stratification economics. Social economics challenges received thinking on economic practice, including investigations of theoretical propositions and theoretical silences, research topics that are valued and research topics that are dismissed out of hand, and the received normative commitments. Social economics is more eclectic than many other traditions in economics and political economy, and that can make it difficult to define and to pin down. But I want to argue that looseness also makes it more amenable to learning from others, to theoretical importations, since it doesn't have a restrictive set of core propositions that it feels it has to defend against all other theoretical combatants. What it does have is a deep commitment to social betterment, the eradication of avoidable suffering, and the enhancement of genuine equality and social and ecological sustainability in the context of inclusive communities. Now, there is much more to be said about all this, but not by me. I want to turn the floor over to our two distinguished speakers, and I will introduce them as they take the podium. And our first presenter is to my left, Dr. Dania Francis. Dania Francis is an associate professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Boston, our host. Her research interests include examining racial and socioeconomic disparities in education, wealth accumulation, and labor markets. She is a faculty affiliate at the Stone Center for Research on wealth inequality and mobility at the Harris School of Public Policy of the University of Chicago. She is also a member of the Boston Federal Reserve Bank's Wealth Survey Research Advisory Council. Professor Francis has also been a board member of the National Economics Association and a 2018 postdoctoral fellow of the National Academies of Education and Spencer Foundation. And I'll just add one more, something about a joint work. Sandy and Denis are also co-editors of a recently published volume, double volume of the Russell Sage Foundation Journal of the Social Sciences, titled Black Reparations, Insights from the Social Sciences. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Francis.
Wonderful. Oh, that was so fast. Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I also want to obviously begin by thanking our hosts, organizers, sponsors. This has been a wonderful conference and summer school so far. So thank you for all the work put into this. So what I'd like to talk about in the time that I have is equitable wealth in historic context. I warn you now, it's going to be very US-centric, economic history. I'm going to focus a lot on black-white wealth gaps. Okay. So I'd like to begin any discussion of wealth by reminding us all about the benefits of wealth. This is not something maybe that I need to do with this audience, but I'll do it for completeness' sake. There are reasons to examine wealth disparities separately and in addition to examining wage and income disparities. Wages and income impact a family's ability to meet their day-to-day expenditures and can feed into a family's ability to accumulate wealth through savings and investment of income. Wealth, however, provides additional benefits beyond those provided by stable wages and income. Having wealth can provide a protective safety net, helping families weather economic shocks such as unexpected unemployment or inability to work due to adverse health events. Having wealth as a protective safety net may also reduce stress and anxiety and improve health outcomes. Wealth also provides access to opportunity. Households with greater wealth are better able to afford homes in neighborhoods with better schools, lower crime, fewer environmental and health stressors, and the risk associated with entrepreneurship can be less costly for higher wealth individuals who have more of a safety net to fall back on should their businesses not succeed. In that sense, wealth provides greater freedom to pursue self-actualization. Finally, wealth can provide access to beneficial social networks and access to those who wield political power. All of these benefits make it important to really examine racial disparities in wealth. So a team of economists that included Alora de Renancourt constructed a continuous series of white to black wealth ratios in the US from 1860 to 2020, compiled from multiple historic and contemporary sources. This was a huge undertaking. For example, they digitized 50 years of state tax reports and benchmarked their estimates against multiple established data sources. For the contemporary data, they relied heavily on the Survey of Consumer Finances. Additionally, and really beneficial to researchers, they made their data publicly available for use. This figure was produced for a report I worked on with Damon Jones, Bradley Hardy, and firm Ramateur using the de Renancourt data, et al. Data. It demonstrates differences in black and white wealth over time. The research from de Renancourt and co-authors tells us a lot about this relationship over time. While black wealth has never really come close to white wealth, there have been periods of convergence over time. The greatest convergence between black and white wealth in the US occurred during the first 40 years after emancipation. From 1870 to 1900, the annual convergence rate was about 2.5%, while from 1900 to 1930, it was only 0.3%. Between 1960 and 1980, there was another period of increased convergence, an annual rate of about 1.5%, as black wealth grew. However, after 1980, there is actually divergence. The black-white wealth gap grew larger over that time period, driven largely by an exponential expansion in wealth for white households. From the date of emancipation, black households were at a significant disadvantage with regards to wealth accumulation. While the relatively small share of black Americans who were free prior to the Civil War had accumulated some wealth and property, the vast majority of black Americans were formally enslaved with virtually no property or wealth at the time of emancipation. Durenencourt and co-authors' estimates suggest that in 1860, 5 years prior to emancipation, black Americans owned 2 cents for every dollar of white wealth. In 1870, 5 years after emancipation, the figure increased to a little over 4 cents for every dollar. However, the gap in wealth at emancipation was so large that simulations suggest that even if black households had the same capital gains and savings rates as white households from 1870 onward, right, to 2020, white households would still have 3 times the wealth as black households today. In the face of this sizable wealth gap, black families accumulated land and property at a rapid pace. In 1875, black families owned 3 million acres of land. By 1890, they had acquired 8 million acres. And by 1910, they owned over 16 million acres. This, however, would be the peak of black farmland ownership in the United States, as the 20th century oversaw the rapid dispossession of black-owned agricultural acreage. Black farmers had acquired this land against a backdrop of extreme racial violence, oftentimes directed at landowners. Historian Pete Daniels' book, Dispossession, chronicles the many ways black farmers were unjustly separated from their land. White planters conspired together to restrict land sales to African Americans. Because many banks refused to lend to African Americans, they had limited credit resources when the Great Depression hit. Even though the federal government enacted massive spending programs to halt the farm crisis of the Great Depression era, the insistency of Southern politicians that these programs be administered at the local level effectively blocked black farmers in the South from receiving any relief. In addition to controlling government benefits, white Southern elites found other ways to take black farmers' land. In one instance, a bank, a crop duster company, and federal officials conspired to force a reverend into debt and out of his land. Another common tactic was for a federal agent to delay a loan to cause a farmer to plant late, reap a smaller harvest, and end up in debt. Available evidence suggests schemes like these were widespread. Black farmers made a direct attack on this system in the 1960s when they worked with civil rights organizers to run election campaigns to integrate USDA county committees. White elites, however, used threats of job loss to repel voters and even resorted to blatant election fraud with no consequences. A series of federal studies, along with numerous investigative reports, have found that USDA agents continued to discriminate against black farmers after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the USDA has never investigated civil rights complaints in a systematic way. Many landowners have also lost their property through racial violence. Luke McElroy, a black farmer who owned 155 acres of land in Cherokee County, Alabama, was shot to death in 1949 by a neighboring white farmer over a property dispute. In Amity County, Mississippi, Reverend Isaac Simmons, also a black farmer, was lynched by 6 white men in 1944 when he refused to give up his farmland to the men who thought it might have valuable oil deposits. The men then brutally beat Reverend Simmons' son and ran him out of the county. The stories of these men and many others that are cataloged in the Burnham Nobles Archive of racially motivated killings of black people in the Jim Crow South at Northeastern University highlight the violent theft of black farmland, often to the benefit of local white farmers. In addition to theft by state-sanctioned violence, intimidation, and lynching, Black farmers also lost land through forced partition sales brought about by predatory third parties, through government misuse of eminent domain, including many cases in which Black landowners were compensated well below market value, through discriminatory tax assessments and non-competitive tax sales, and through long-standing coordinated discrimination by USDA agents who wield power and control over access to credit and essential resources. By 1997, Black farmers lost more than 90% of the 16 million acres they owned in 1910. Precipitous decline. In a recent study, I had the opportunity to work with an impressive group of co-authors. We used county-level Census of Agriculture data to estimate the value of the lost Black agricultural land from 1920 to 1997. For all counties in each of the 17 mostly southern states that comprised over 90% of all Black owned farmland, we calculated the yearly acreage loss multiplied by the county level estimate of per acre land values. We then compounded those land loss values forward to the year 2020 at a rate of return of 6% per year for the appreciation of the land and a rate of return of 5% per year for the income the land could provide. Our results yield a cumulative value of Black land loss of about $326 billion, with a range of $265 billion to $359 billion, depending on the specification we use. To put this figure in perspective, if this represented the gross domestic product of a country, that country would rank 41st out of 213 countries in a world ranking of GDP in 2020. This would be in the top 20% of countries, ahead of South Africa, Finland, and New Zealand. We view $326 billion to be a conservative estimate of the value of Black land loss for multiple reasons. First, we used conservative rates of return on agricultural land in our calculations. Second, due to data limitations, we begin the calculation of the loss in 1920, missing a whole decade of loss from 1910 to 1920, after that peak land ownership. Thus, our estimate does not account for the lost acreage in the first 10 years, which again would have compounded, right, even further. Finally, we don't include other potential benefits to land ownership in our estimate, such as the ability of landowners to have more control over their labor and free time, more access to capital to invest in other business ventures, and more resources to provide access to high-quality education for their children so the next generation could experience upward mobility. The intergenerational aspect of land wealth is precisely what makes the estimation of historic Black land loss so relevant to discussions of racial wealth gaps today. As a result of having their land stolen from them, many Black landowners lost a valuable tool for wealth creation. Accordingly, while the children and grandchildren of white landowners reap the benefits of ready access to capital, education, home ownership, entrepreneurial safety nets, the children and grandchildren of dispossessed Black landowners face the perils of migrating to segregated inner cities, crime, poverty, and instability. In addition to the wealth lost from land theft, Black Americans have been denied access to wealth accumulation through multiple government policies. To name just a few, right? New Deal social welfare legislation initially excluded 65% of Black workers from receiving Social Security benefits by excluding domestic and farm workers. The administration of aid to dependent children was allowed to be locally run at the request of Southern segregationists, who then systematically denied benefits to local Black populations through the dubious requirement of restricting funding to suitable homes, right? Who is suitable and who is not, we know. Unemployment insurance was also denied to domestic and farm workers and had the added requirement of demonstrating prior, regular, stable employment. Discrimination in labor markets made it such that Black workers were often the last hired and the first fired, and therefore less likely to be able to demonstrate this prior stability. Another example, right, housing market discrimination, restrictive covenants, redlining, blockbusting, and outright violence and intimidation excluded Black families from neighborhoods of opportunity and health. And when black families were able to develop strong neighborhoods, even against all these odds, many of them were razed to the ground during urban renewal. Right? Those who stayed behind in these broken neighborhoods were subject to the added health stressors of living next to a tangle of highways. Researchers at Tufts, working on ultrafine particles in air pollution, have demonstrated that these ultrafine particles are more prevalent in neighborhoods near highways. This matters because the ultrafine particles are so small that they're not covered by our federal protections, and they're small enough such that they don't just get into the respiratory system, but they get into the bloodstream, which could possibly increase instances of heart disease and strokes. Here, we can connect the dots from government policy to wealth to health. These barriers to access to wealth and opportunity are not just in our past, they're ongoing, right? Today, they may take the form of exclusionary zoning policies. If you want to exclude black families from neighborhoods today, you don't have to engage in blatant discrimination. You can just pass a local zoning ordinance that requires all residential properties to sit on at least 1.5 acres or to be single-family dwellings, right? This has the effect of pricing out many black families from these neighborhoods because they don't have the wealth endowment necessary to afford properties with those restrictions. In a sense, capitalizing on the results of past racial discrimination. I juxtapose this history of structural discrimination and denial of wealth accumulation with individually based explanations for racial wealth gaps. Individually based explanations usually point to differences between black and white households in savings rates, investment portfolio allocations, differences in risk-taking and entrepreneurship, failure to, quote, buy and bank black, right, and differences in education and employment. These explanations are often lacking support in research evidence or lacking in their ability to actually make a significant dent in the racial wealth gap. For example, the savings rates of black households are not different from those in white households after controlling for income. Entrepreneurship is often a riskier proposition for black households precisely because they don't have the same wealth safety nets to fall back on. The black-white wealth gap is significantly larger among the college-educated and beyond. Thanks to work by Sandy and co-authors, we know that in 2014, among households where the head had less than a high school diploma, white households had about $80,000 more wealth than black households. For high school graduates, the gap was about $112,000. Among college graduates, the gap was nearly $200,000. And for those with post-college educational attainment, white households had over $314,000 more wealth than black families. Educational attainment creates more debt for black households than it does for white households. So even though higher educational attainment leads to increased wealth for both black and white households, it widens the black-white wealth gap since black students are more likely to have to finance their education through debt. Why? Because they don't have the intergenerational wealth, right, that we were talking about. As another example, Christian Weller and I, in a 2022 paper in the Journal of Retirement, have looked at how additional financial risk faced by black households, Latina households, and other households of color differentially impact their retirement savings, a form of wealth. First, we use the Census Household Pulse data to demonstrate that during the pandemic, black households, Latina households, and households of other or multiple races were more likely to need to borrow money from friends and family to weather economic stressors brought on by the pandemic. We also demonstrate, using data from the Survey of Consumer Finances, that there are racial differences in who is seeking informal financial support from friends and family. In particular, black households are receiving requests for help from a wider variety of contacts. Finally, we conduct descriptive regression analyses where we conclude that black households are more likely to borrow from their retirement savings to meet the demands of informal financial requests from family and friends, but that they also have higher savings rates into their retirement savings when they face these requests, possibly to make up for the penalties and interest from borrowing. Black households then are basically running in place, right, with regards to retirement savings when faced with helping out family. They're borrowing more, but they're also saving more, only to end up with lower overall retirement savings than their white counterparts. We argue that this is not a matter of improving financial literacy, but rather improving the social safety nets that can help lower the need for Black households to engage in financially supporting other family members. As a final note on individual-based solutions, Alora Derenoncourt and co-authors in the paper I previously referenced have estimated that, quote, to close the wealth gap by 2050, Blacks would need more than double the capital gains rates of white Americans, 7.5% compared to 2%, a savings rate of 37% out of income, right, as opposed to a 4% savings rate for whites. This is crazy. Or annual real income growth of nearly 15%, as opposed to 1.5% for white families, end quote. Individually based solutions are not sufficient. To view racial wealth gaps as the result of individual differences ignores the legacy of state-sanctioned discrimination that limited Black wealth building at the outset and persists today through intergenerational transmission of wealth and through ongoing discriminatory structures in our society. So what are the paths forward? They have to involve bold, targeted solutions that are informed by this history and that dig deep into the systems of disadvantage that have grown over time and are now self-sustaining. Sandy and I have both worked on the economic implications of reparations for Black Americans as a policy solution, Sandy much more so than me. And I'm happy to talk in more detail about that in the Q&A, but for now, I will leave it there and turn the conversation back over. Thank you.
Wonderful. Our next speaker is Dr. William Sandy Darity, Jr. Sandy Darity is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies, Economics, and Business, and the director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. In 2005, he launched the subspecialty of stratification economics. Sandy is a 2024 Distinguished Fellow of the American Economic Association, a 2023 Radcliffe Fellow at Harvard University, one of the inaugural Distinguished Fellows of the Southern Economic Association in 2023, the 2022 W.E.B. Du Bois Fellow of the Academy of Social Insurance, the Du Bois Fellow of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, and he became a Fellow of the National Academy of Social Insurance in 2021. He received the Samuel Z. Westerfeld Award from the National Economic Association in 2012. He and Kirsten Mullen are co-authors of the award-winning From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, published in 2020. Please join me in welcoming Professor Darity.
Thank you very much. I discovered when I was in India that there is a tradition at convenings of this type that resembles what happens in Black Baptist churches in the United States, which is the speaker is obligated to recognize the distinguished individuals in the audience. This can go on for a while. And it also poses the problem of leaving out somebody who merits attention. But I'm going to try my best. Okay. So first, I'd like to thank Provost Berger and Dean Prasad. Well, they were here. Okay. And I'd also like to thank my dear friend Amitava Dutt, who initially was the person who communicated with me about the possibility of giving a presentation at this conference. I also like to thank Lila Davis and Harry Konstantinidis for all the work they've done in making this conference happen. And I'd like to thank John and Zora for having Lila. But also, I'd like to thank John for the work that he's done in extending stratification economics. And then there are three old friends that I need to mention, Randy Abelda, Art McEwen, and Gary Dembski. And there are some new friends, but I'm not going to try to list them all. I would like to say I'm very grateful to share the stage with Dania Francis. In 2003, we published a paper together called The Economics of Reparations that appeared in the Proceedings of the American Economic Association. And I think it was the first paper on reparations by economists that had been written and published since Robert Brown's work in the 1970s. And I suspect there was no economist who had written anything significant about reparations before Robert Brown. Now, I was trying to consider two types of talks this evening. The first was a talk that I was thinking about presenting on the whole question of this body of literature that claims that everybody could benefit if we got rid of racism. Okay, so you can suspect that my answer is that that's not the case. And the second was to try to engage in a confrontation with racial capitalism, or the concept of racial capitalism, which is very popular in critical theory circles. But I'm going to pivot away from both of those after hearing Dania's presentation, and I'm going to talk about what reparations ought to look like. Okay, so I'd also like to mention a couple of non-incremental policies that are related to the list of policies that Dania described that have led to the black-white wealth disparity. So in the 19th century, in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, the United States government essentially made a pledge to the newly emancipated persons that they would receive 40-acre land grants as restitution for their years of bondage. This was a promise that was not met. On the other hand, under the auspices of the Homestead Act of 1862, the federal government provided 1.5 million white families with 160-acre land grants in the Western Territories as the nation completed its colonial settler project. And so while white American households were getting 160-acre land grants, black American households were not even receiving the 1/4 allotment that they had been promised. And from my perspective, that is the beginning of the racial wealth gap in the aftermath of the period of slavery. I would add that in the 20th century, the federal government shifts away from its reliance upon land distribution as a mechanism for asset building to home buying support as its mechanism for asset building. And it does this in a highly discriminatory fashion. Dania mentioned redlining, for example, but one also has to take note of the significance of, again, another non-incremental policy, the GI Bill, which provided not only educational subsidies for returning veterans from World War II, but also resources for business ownership and for home ownership. And this also was applied in a highly discriminatory fashion, promoting white wealth accumulation to the detriment of black Americans. So those are two additional non-incremental policies that I think we need to be aware of in the context of thinking about the processes that produce the contemporary racial wealth gap in the United States. Before saying what reparations ought to look like in the United States, let me define what I mean by reparations. And I'm going to draw upon the definition that Kirsten Mullen and I used at the beginning of our book, From Here to Equality. We refer to the acronym ARC, Acknowledgement, Redress, and Closure, as the three features of reparations. We define reparations as a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice. By acknowledgement, we mean that the culpable party admits its responsibility for the harms that have taken place and this is crucial, indicates that they will engage in an act of redress. Okay? Redress is the second component of this, and this takes the form of an act of restitution on the part of the culpable party, which typically, with respect to victimized communities who are supposed to be receiving compensation, constitutes a monetary payment. And then the last component of the definition of reparations that we utilize is closure. And this means that the culpable party and the victimized community come to an agreement that the debt has been paid, that the account is settled, and the victimized community will make no further claims on the culpable party unless there is a renewal of the atrocities or new atrocities take place. So what should reparations look like in the United States? Reparations specifically for Black Americans. Well, there has to be 4 characteristics that I'm going to focus on. The first is eligibility. The second is the amount. The third is who is responsible for paying. And the fourth is what form will the payments take. So let me begin with eligibility. In the work that Kirsten and I have done, we've emphasized 2 standards for eligibility for receipt of reparations. The first is what we refer to as a lineage standard, and the second is what we refer to as an identity standard. The lineage standards has it that recipients of reparations must be individuals who can demonstrate that they have at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States of America. And the second, the identity standard, has it now that an individual would have had to have self-identified as Black, Negro, African American, or Afro-American for at least 12 years before the adoption of a reparations plan or the adoption of a study commission for reparations. Now, in the old paper that Dania and I did, I think we had 10 years in there. And then Kirsten and I changed it to 12 years because there was more of a conversation about this, and we were trying to evade what we view as a moral hazard problem of people suddenly declaring that they were Black to be able to get reparations. And we may have to make it longer than that as time goes by. But 12 years corresponds to 2 senatorial terms, so it seemed like it was a roughly reasonable standard. And in addition, the lineage standard can be met through the use of proper genealogical research. And we do not mean use of DNA testing or skin shade testing or anything along those lines. Individual would simply have to establish through genealogical research of the type that Henry Louis Gates presents us with on a weekly basis, that they had at least one ancestor who had been subjected to enslavement in the United States. The identity standard can be met by revealing your self-reported race in the census. Individuals have the right to make the confidential information in their census return public, so they can make that specific line where they've responded to the race question public information. Now, the obvious complaint that's been raised about these criteria is that it does not provide reparatory justice for individuals who are Black in the United States, who are not ancestrally linked to the process of enslavement in the United States. And of course, we would argue that virtually all peoples of the African diaspora who live as Black have a case for reparations, but they don't all have a case for reparations from the United States government. So we have to think in a very specific way about the relationship between the atrocities that are pertinent to specific groups of Black people and the relevant culpable party. So for illustrative purposes, if we were thinking about Haiti, the French government would have responsibility for meeting a reparations bill. And of course, the irony in the Haitian case is that the Haitians were compelled to pay reparations to France. And so they should get that money back with interest, as well as additional sums of money. Now, I will say that the Haitian case is particularly interesting because one could argue that they also have a claim on the U.S. government because they were subjected to U.S. colonization for some period of time. Okay. But the general idea is the following. The, the peoples of countries like Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago would have a claim on the United Kingdom. The peoples of the Congo would have a claim on Belgium. And the peoples of Namibia in southern Africa, the two tribal communities there that were subjected to German genocide, have a claim on Germany. I think Germany's offered to give them something trivial, but it has not been satisfactory from the standpoint of the community that was victimized, and so closure has not taken place. Okay. Second thing I would like to describe as an attribute of a suitable reparations program in the United States is the amount that should be due. And if we focus carefully on the presentation that Dania just gave, we could identify the racial wealth gap as providing us with a calculation that's useful for determining the size of the bill for reparations in the United States. And I argue that the racial wealth gap is of particular significance because it provides us with an economic indicator of the cumulative intergenerational cost of white supremacy in the United States. And unlike trying to cost out the expenses of slavery, which is something that has been done quite effectively, we are talking about a cost or a penalty to the living descendants of persons who were enslaved, not the costs that are associated with the direct application of the atrocity of slavery. We haven't experienced slavery. Okay, so the question is, what are the harms that we are experiencing? And I think one could argue that those harms are closely connected to the magnitude of the racial wealth gap in the United States. So what is that gap? And as an aside, let me point out that when there's evidence of convergence in the ratio of black to white wealth, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is a convergence in the dollar amount of the gap. Okay. And in fact, if you look at the survey of consumer finances between 2019 and 2022, you will find that actually there's been a slight decline in the ratio of white to black wealth, but the dollar value gap has expanded substantially, both in nominal and real terms, so that we're at a point where the average white household has $1.15 million more than the average black household. And if we were to adjust that figure for household size, which is, household size is not identical by race in the United States, if we were to adjust that figure by household size, it would give us an estimated $400,000 that were due, would be due to each eligible recipient. If there are about 40 million black Americans who would be eligible for reparations, then that gives us a total of $16 trillion. Now, mention was made of the new issue of the Russell Sage Foundation's journal, which Dania and I were two of the co-editors for. And in that particular issue, there's a paper by Elizabeth Wrigley Field where she focuses on something different as a particular standard for estimating the racial wealth gap. Elizabeth focuses on the longevity gap between black and white Americans, which is approximately 5 years or so, 5 to 6 years now. So if you use that longevity gap and you utilize the statistical value of a human life, which conservatively is about $10 million, you can assign a dollar value for each year of life that black Americans do not have in equivalence with white Americans. And you can come up with a total estimate that's actually almost 2 times as large as the wealth gap estimate, $28 trillion. So, if folks want the easy way out, use the wealth gap estimate, okay? Third, who pays? The federal government. The federal government is both the culpable party and the capable party. It's the culpable party because of the historical set of policies that Dania talked about that are responsible for the existing wealth gap. It's also those sets of policies that are responsible for the conditions that have produced the longevity gap in the United States as well. There's a host of states and localities. Well, a host. It feels like it's a host. There are probably about 50 states and localities that profess to be undertaking reparations plans in the moment. Now, there are, of course, in excess of 100,000 localities in the United States, and there are 50 states. So, we're really not talking about a large proportion of all of the states and localities in the United States. Nevertheless, these initiatives have gained a lot of attention because of the contentiousness of reparations as an issue in the United States. But I want to argue that it is impossible for states and localities or for individuals and organizations to actually conduct a reparations plan. And I've tended to say that state and local reparations really is something that's oxymoronic. Why is this the case? Well, if we take my smaller bill, the wealth gap-based bill of $16 trillion, the total combined budgets of all states and localities in the United States is less than $5 trillion. So it's a virtual impossibility for them to finance this without an extreme increase in taxes. Because unlike the federal government, and for those of you who are MMT fans, you'll appreciate what I'm saying now. Unlike the federal government, states and localities are in fact constrained by their tax bases. Federal government is not. But the federal government's capability is embodied in its capacity to meet a payment building this large, which is reflected in the fact that the federal government amassed huge sums of money very quickly in response to both the Great Recession and the pandemic. And it did so without increasing taxes. What could go wrong? Well, of course, in the instance of the funding of the response to the great pandemic, we generated fairly substantial inflation on delay or on lag, but there it was. And so in the design of any significant new expenditure program at the federal level, we have to be cognizant of the potential risk of significant inflation, and we have to design the program in such a way that we minimize the inflation risk. Now, in From Here to Equality, Kirsten and I actually suggest that there are two steps that could mitigate the magnitude of the inflation risk. The first step is to parse the payments out over a series of years. Now, we say in our book, let's not make it more than a decade. But if you were to parse the payments out over 10 years, we're talking about $16 trillion total, then that's about $1.6 trillion every year. That's a very different kind of impact on the economy than putting the $16 trillion in at once. Second mechanism is to make those payments take the form of less liquid assets. So they could take the form of annuities, endowments, trust accounts, which can't be spent in full immediately. And so this would, and this would also effectively build assets in a very direct way. And so as a consequence, you could reduce the risk of inflation. Fourth and finally, the question can be raised, how should these payments be made? And we've argued fairly consistently that they should be made in direct fashion to eligible recipients. In fact, as I'm talking about the $16 trillion figure, this would amount to about $400,000 per eligible recipient. And so we have in mind a program where each eligible recipient receives the same amount. We're not going to play this game of trying to determine who among the eligible recipient population is more deserving. Okay, so we just give the same amount to everybody, and this would be a payment that they could use at their own discretion. That's the key thing, that each individual recipient would have full discretion over the use of the funds. So there would be no third party. There would be nothing like what's been proposed by the organization, the National African American Reparations Coalition, for a National Reparations Trust Fund. There would be no third party that would have responsibility for determining what happens to the money. And one of the reasons for this is that this would be entirely consistent with the way in which reparations have been paid to other victimized communities. Two obvious examples are the payments that the German government has made to victims of the Holocaust and their heirs, and the payments that the United States government has made to Japanese Americans who were subjected to mass incarceration during the course of World War II. So there you have the structure of a reparations plan. The last thing I'd like to do is share, if I can, some opening passages to the first essay in the volume, The Black Reparations Project, which was edited by Kirsten Mullen, Lucas Hubbard, and myself. And that first chapter is called Where Does Black Reparations in America Stand? And I'd like to share this because of the political climate in the United States today, and because of our perception of the way in which the American narrative has been constructed to craft significant opposition to addressing the question of reparative justice for Black Americans. So let me just read this passage. On January 6, 2021, urged on by President Trump's false claim that the 2020 election had been stolen from him, a terrorist mob invaded the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. The intent was to execute a coup d'etat to maintain Trump's regime, imperiling elected officials from both parties, at least one of whom we saw running on film. Hawley? Yeah. The Capitol invaders brought with them the trappings and regalia of the Confederacy. Now, Hawley's case is funny because he was one of the people who instigated the riot, but then he was running for safety. Okay. They also carried the full spirit and heritage of the Confederacy. In the aftermath of the Civil War, it was the defeated Confederates who violently sought to win the peace by a campaign of sustained terror directed against the freedmen. Time and again, they overthrew duly elected local governments, co-governed by coalitions of newly emancipated blacks and pro-union whites, including ousters of elected officials at St. Landry Parish in Louisiana in 1868, Colfax, Louisiana in 1873, Coushatta, Louisiana in 1874, Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1874, Fort Bend County in Texas in 1888, and Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. The January 6th assault on the national government runs in a straight line from the most concerted previous attempt to destroy the United States of America, the secession of the 11 states that formed the Confederate States of America 163 years ago. Indeed, the attempted coup on January 6th is symptomatic of the long-term failure to deconfederatize American society. In contrast with Germany's active policy of denazification, nothing similar has occurred with respect to the prominence of the lost cause narrative of the nation's history and the memorialization of the leaders of the Southern secession. We frequently hear the aphorism, "the winners write the history," but this has not been the case with respect to U.S. history. Via organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Confederates and their ideological descendants crafted the story of the nation's past. In the United States, the losers of the Civil War, have faced little resistance as they have written the nation's history. False images abound of kindly slaveholders, generously conducting a civilizing mission on behalf of the Africans who were held as their human property, of the civil wars motivated by the pursuit of civil rights, of states' rights rather, of Reconstruction as a travesty of black misrule under the manipulation of scallywags and carpetbaggers, and of the Confederates as dignified patriots seeking to preserve the principles of the American Revolution. All of these lies are a product of the work of the UDC and the DAR. They have suppressed the accurate narrative of the formation of the Confederacy as a traitorous act born of insistence on maintaining an oppressive system of economic exploitation, slavery. And this is why we have an ideological resistance to the adoption of a just America.
We have some time for Q&A. I think we're going to handle this. Harry, are you going to bring a microphone around the room so that your voice can be recorded? We have a number of students in the room who are part of the summer school. How about if we give priority to some of them in asking questions? So if you're a summer school student, raise your left hand. Harry, pay attention. If you're a summer school student, raise your left hand. Everybody else raise their right hand. Harry, your job is to go find those left hands. I see some. Right in the center here, straight up. And to the presenters, would you like to receive a few questions and then respond, or one by one? Any preference? One by one. Okay, to start, and then if we start running out of time.
Hey.
So please introduce yourself and get us started.
Hi, I'm Deborah Nunes, a PhD graduate from Colorado State. Be starting at Monmouth University as a professor next semester. It's such an honor to be listening to y'all. I've been a big fan of your work, obviously, for a long time, so I feel really privileged to be selected to the summer school, which was amazing, by the way. Thank you for that, and to be in this audience. My question is associated with the concept of enslavement and which populations to count as enslaved populations. I'm very ignorant about the history of the United States, but it is my understanding that even after the Civil War, there were a lot of workers who were still under enslavement conditions of work, and even nowadays you could make a strong case that the mass incarceration of black populations and the conditions of work, of unpaid work for freedom inside the incarceration facilities is a form of enslavement. And when you think about that in the international context, those lines of when, for example, I'm from Brazil, and when enslavement officially ended in Brazil, we would still have a lot of enslaved populations working, especially in rural areas. So I would like to hear y'all's conceptual framework on how to define enslavement so that we can have a clearer legislation in terms of reparations. Thank you.
So the phenomenon of slavery, as I'm interpreting it, involves the capacity of one individual to own another human being as a piece of personal property. So in principle, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution ended that as a practice with the exception of individuals who are subjected to incarceration. And so I think it's important to recognize that in the context of the particular approach to reparations that we've been talking about, the premise is not that reparations is for slavery per se. Reparations is something that is owed to the individuals who are descendants of persons who were subjected to slavery, but those individuals also might be folks who would be exposed to the so-called modern forms of slavery as well. And hopefully, from an economic standpoint, that's something that's captured in the racial wealth gap. It might also be captured in the longevity gap as well in terms of the consequences of incarceration on people's health and well-being. But the premise is that we're getting at those kinds of effects indirectly if we use as our summary measure for determining what the size of the reparations bill should be, of something that should be capturing some of the consequences of those effects. And with respect to Brazil, Brazil is a particularly interesting case because the Afro-descendant population in Brazil has a claim not only on Portugal, but on the Brazilian government because slavery persisted after independence, unlike other portions of South America. Yeah.
Back and forth between each of you. Other left hands? Please. And then we'll open it up to everyone.
Hi, my name is Riva Restak. I'm a PhD student from American University. I was born and raised in DC and have concerns about the upcoming election. I know there have been historical pushbacks to progress, and I'm wondering in this election year what you all can offer to this very international audience of your opinion of the current political moment.
Yes, no? Yeah?
I mean, I have to. You gotta take that. No, I don't know if my answer will do justice to your question. That was a good question, and it's big. I thought you were going to ask about political climate's pushbacks in the context of reparations, which I'm more prepared to talk about. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But I have been looking at this issue of reparations for Black Americans for, I guess, now over 20 years. And in that time, I've seen ebbs and flows of interest, right? There would be like some conference that made people interested in it, and it would catch the news, and then it would go away, right? This recent interest has been the most prolonged interest that I've seen, and it hasn't gone away. And so I think that's one, it's encouraging, but two, as you so rightly pointed out, there are periods of progress, right, followed by periods of like backlash and retrenchment. And I think that we're in a period of backlash right now, but that interestingly enough, we've still seen the conversation about reparations, about social justice, right, around a lot of these issues continue. And so maybe to sort of bring it around a little bit to your question, I am encouraged that in the US, we're always going to take some steps forward and some steps back, but that good people continue, right, to try to make progress in what seems like the fair and socially just things to do.
Just a supplementary comment. We're in a paradoxical position right now because we're potentially on the verge of a comprehensive fascist takeover of the country. But at the same time, we probably have more political support for reparations than we have ever had. It's very strange. In the year 2000, approximately 4% of white Americans said that they favored monetary payments as reparations for Black Americans. And as of January 2023, a survey conducted at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst found that it was closer to 30% of white Americans. And with respect to the Black American population, the proportion has increased from about 65% to close to 90%. And so in principle, there is more support for reparations than ever, but I guess that's part of the interlocking crises that we're talking about. Yeah.
Yes, go ahead, Harry.
Thank you very much for your presentations and comments on various topics. I am Enoch Bulime. I originally come from Uganda, and I'm a PhD student at Kansas State University. My question is, how can we frame the race and social stratification discourse in a way that will create sustained interest in the scholarly and policy world to create long-lasting results?
You should talk about your Journal of Economics. I shouldn't tell you what to say.
No, it's fine. Okay, so again, how can we frame discussions around race and social stratification? That's good. No, you're right, Sandy. I had the pleasure of working with, again, Damon Jones and Bradley Hardy, who also identifies Black economist, on a paper for the Journal of Economic Literature about what do Black economists have to say about policy. And so, right, in doing that, we sort of undertook this large literature review, and in the end, decided we would choose to highlight what Black economists have to say about these issues, these large issues around inequality, when they are at their most critical. And so I think that amplifying those critical voices into a space where they have not really been received is a start. We had the opportunity to highlight a lot of the work of economists like Sandy, like Patrick Mason, the late Rhonda Williams, right? Like I can keep going on, but published in the Review of Black Political Economy, right? We know what it is to work as sort of in a pluralistic way, right? And find your work not necessarily received in the mainstream. And I think that as more of, in this case, Black economists are in spaces in the mainstream and are able to highlight this work, I think the conversations begin to be had. And so in addition to that, right, as more of you, right, your work is heard, that does a service to the field overall as well. So I guess to sort of shorten it and nip it in the bud, continuing to do the work, right, and publish, publishing in the places that value the work, because then those footprints are there, right? And so, for example, our work on reparations, right, would probably have sat, right, unlooked at for a long time, and then all of a sudden, Sandy and I are called left and right because we have the one paper in the AA, right, the AA Papers and Proceedings on Reparations. So just continuing to do the work would be what I say.
Yeah, I think it's a struggle, I think that some of the attention that the work is getting today is very surprising to me and unexpected. My partner, Kirsten Mullen, always says, well, you leave the bread on the water and maybe eventually somebody will pick it up. Maybe they won't, but you've got to leave the bread on the water. But it is a struggle because if you're involved in the development of a subfield that has somewhat of an insurgent character, it is not going to be rapidly embraced by the profession at large. Not in the way in which the profession plunged towards behavioral economics, for example. So, there are things we're trying to do. One of them is actually start a journal of stratification economics. And we made some overtures to the Cambridge University Press because I actually am a series editor for one of their groups of books that's called Cambridge Studies in Stratification Economics. I thought, well, since they're publishing those books, maybe they'll publish a journal. And there was initially there was a very positive reaction, and then when we started having further conversations with their editorial team, got to be less and less enthusiastic. And we finally found out that what had happened was that they had approached one of the faculty members in the economics department at Cambridge, and the person said he'd never heard of stratification economics. And so that actually squashed the deal. But we're now talking to another press, which I think is equally distinguished. We'll see what happens. But yeah, it's not something easy. And you don't want to kowtow to the conventional approaches to such a degree that you destroy what is unique and important about the approach you're trying to develop.
Sure.
What's the JEL, Sandy? Z13? Yeah, I mean, so just to, right, like, so stratification economics, we have a JEL code, right, that Sandy and others, right, like, it's not, it's, yeah. Economic stratification, and it's Z13 in a world where A is primary, right? And so anyway, and so anytime somebody asks me for a JEL code on my papers, I'm like Z13. I don't know if it's even right. Like, so I mean, that's one.
Harry, do you have? Go ahead, please.
Hi, sorry, I wasn't sure how loud it was going to be, depending on how close I was. To connect with the interdisciplinary nature of stratification economics and Dr. Francis' mention of the agricultural land loss of African American farmers, I immediately thought of the work of Dr. Jessica B. Harris, you know, that culminated in her book High on the Hog, that she looked at the transatlantic slave trade through the food that was brought over, and especially the agricultural skills that were explicitly sought when looking to enslave people and bring them over to different sections of the country. And it frames it in the way of also viewing African Americans as descendants of enslaved Africans as land protectors and cultivators. So I was wondering, with the agricultural land loss, we could probably also, at least theoretically, hypothesize the ecological damage that also followed through this. And I guess my question is, I personally believe that to understand the magnitude of this history, it would be important to calculate that in a theory and, you know, practical bill of reparations. But I also understand that this may be something that to do if we're trying to pass something that actually gets implemented. It could increase the cost past feasibility and just slow down and complicate the process. So I just wanted to pose that to hear both of your thoughts. Huh? Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so bad at this. My name is Micaela Sabi. I'm a PhD student at Colorado State University.
I mean, one of the tricky issues is how you go about measuring the size of the bill. And there are two basic approaches. One is to identify an array of harms and damages, assign a monetary value to each of them, and add it up. And that's not exactly what I've been talking about. I've been trying to say, let's identify a summary measure that captures these harms, and it may not adequately capture the type of harm you're talking about. But if you were going to go the enumeration route, then that could be on the list of the bill of particulars. But it's tricky. And then of course there's the question of how you'd go about assigning a monetary value to that type of damage. But you know, if you were going the enumeration route, that's a way. That's a damage that you could include. Yeah.
Yeah, I thank you for that, Sandy. I agree, and I think that I think it's important, even academically, right, to pursue calculations and estimations of that sort. Even if in the end a reparations program is built not on, sort of separate calculations of atrocities, it's good to know, right? One, and two, it may be good to have a bill that's even higher than the 14 trillion, right? you say, look, you're getting off easy. And so as someone who just went through this exercise of calculating Black land loss, right, as a sort of separate from the racial wealth gap, I think it's important information and a way to continue to establish the historical record and narrative. And then I also just wanted to say I think it's important to acknowledge. I talk about Black land loss and dispossession, and I always feel like it's important to acknowledge sort of the initial dispossession of land in the U.S. From indigenous peoples, and I don't ever mean to not acknowledge that when talking about, right, Black land dispossession as well.
We have just 7 minutes. So why don't we do this? If you've got questions, can you put your hands up quickly so we can see how many people? Many. So Harry, can you gather, let's say 3 questions, and then we'll give the presenters a chance.
Thank you so much for your presentations. And my name's Kurt Zem. I'm a PhD candidate at the New School for Social Research, and I want to actually taking the point you just made about indigenous people. When in San Antonio this year, I got the pleasure of meeting Laura Derrera-Court and Trayvon Logan and actually discussing this problem with them. For reparations, have you ever considered to look at the consumption aspect of it? And the reason I bring that up is around 2 years ago, using Census Bureau data, I found that Black men and women pay more for water utility bills than every other race in this country. So even if we do, once we do, and rightly your research goes into the wealth aspect of it, but even if we do fix that wealth aspect because of the dispossession of land that you were just discussing, when they even pay for electricity, water, and those things, you get a feedback loop that further kind of perpetuates this inequality. So I was wondering within your within both your frameworks for that consumption aspect of reparations.
Can you hear me? Hi, Paulo dos Santos from the New School. We seem to be the closing act here. Thank you very much for these talks. It's a real treat to be here. I wanted to push, I have 2 questions for both speakers, motivated by something that Sandy says. Sandy, you said you thought about framing this presentation as a polemic on the concept of racial capitalism. So I wanted to invite you to say a few things by way of what your take is on that. And the reason I ask takes me to the second question. I'm not bought on necessarily on the concept of racial capitalism, but what it does is that it takes 2 distinct things. One, capitalism, and the other one is white supremacy or anti-blackness or structural racism or racial oppression. And it posits that they are logically part of the same phenomenon. And that presents what some take to be a seductive political hypothesis, that namely the social struggle to overcome both things is the same. Now the problem is that, of course, the socialists will want to get rid of the capitalism, and then you just gotta wait, it's coming afterwards for the anti-blackness or white supremacy to go away. So that's problematic. I understand that. But given then the reality of white supremacy, anti-blackness, racial oppression, how do you think we are going to deal with that within a framework of a march towards equality that's based on reparations? Is the white supremacy going to be something that starts to ebb away as a result of the very same social mobilizations that will give us success in leading to reparations? Is it that the conquest of wealth will fundamentally transform perceptions and relations? Or are there broader parts of social and political mobilization that will be absolutely integral to the overall effort, of which reparations are an integral part? Thank you.
Kurt, is that your question? Thank you for that. Yeah, you're right, and it brings me to we have an institute here, Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass Boston, that really focuses on issues of climate justice, right, energy justice, and there are absolutely people who are doing very good work in this area, because there are definitely, right, aspects of disparities, differential health impacts, right, in addition to like the cost, right, in your wallets. And so I guess my brief answer would be that this is absolutely one of those areas that I would encourage additional research and information and knowledge in, and sort of like adding it to the, right, like the research, the information.
Okay, so I can't, I'm not going to give my full presentation. I'm troubled by two things that I've observed in the literature that I've seen on racial capitalism. The first is I'm not satisfied with the way in which people have defined it. And the second thing is they frequently are silent about Marx in an analysis of racial capitalism, frequently on the grounds that Marx never said anything about race, which is not true. And so, you know, an example of the problems here is Gargi Bhattacharya's definition, where they write that racial capitalism is a way of understanding the role of racism in enabling key moments of capitalist development. I mean, it's entirely circular, right? And then, and in fact, as I said, Marx had a great deal to say about this, particularly in his analysis of the emergence of colonial systems and the racialization of colonial systems. And there's this amazing quotation that, let me see if I can find it in here. Marx says something about, slavery, pure and simple in the New World, was the pedestal on which, well, I don't know, it's called free labor in Europe, and so he makes a direct connection between the enslavement of Africans in the New World and the status of the proletariat in Europe. And so I think there is something that we could call racial capitalism. Maybe it should be called racialized capitalism. I'm not sure where we have examples of societies where we have pure class differentiation without one social group or another being disproportionately concentrated at the bottom and another being disproportionately concentrated at the top. But the big point I wanted to make in my paper is that this phenomenon of racialization or racism is associated with hierarchy. Not necessarily capitalist hierarchy per se, but hierarchy of all types, because hierarchical conditions create an incentive for identifying your own group as one that's going to be insulated or protected from the most severe deprivations of the social system. And so the last part of my discussion is about this notion that we're not necessarily a capitalist society anymore, but we are still a hierarchical society.
All right, an announcement. There will be a reception right after we finish here downstairs in the big foyer. Are you going to be able to attend? Yeah. Yes, and our speakers are both attending. So if you have questions that they weren't able to get to, you'll have another opportunity if you buy them a drink or something. Please, please.